The crisis surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine suddenly seems even more frightening than before, and people have begun to think the unthinkable. This as Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened the world at large, suggesting perhaps that he could be ready to use nuclear weapons. It's a move that has triggered widespread fears, unparalleled since the Cold War. So the question we're asking here on To The Point is, Putin's threat, is Russia ready to use the nuclear option? And to discuss that question, I'm joined by Teri Schultz. She is security and defence specialist with Deutsche Welle in Brussels. Welcome to you. Also with us is another DW colleague, Vladimir Esipov from our Russia desk, who joins us from London. And a warm welcome to Malte Lehming, who's with me here in the studio. He's with the Berlin daily newspaper, the Tagesspiegel. And Malte, let me begin with you and Vladimir Putin's announcement that he is putting nuclear forces on high alert. The debate must be that he is willing to use the nuclear option. Is that how it seems to you?
Not really. I mean, it's always hard to tell what is in the mind and the head of Vladimir Putin. But if he's really willing to do it, or if he's more aiming at the nerve costume of the West, trying to spread fear and try to disunify the astonishingly unified Western bloc, I think this is more or less what he's aiming at. He did the same in 2014. I think it's the second grade of a 4-grade alert system. So it's not the highest alert, but on alert. And he's reminding us, and by us I mean the West, that we're dealing with a country not like Afghanistan or Iraq, but a nuclear power. And that's what we do. OK. Teri Schultz in Brussels. Vladimir Putin has already used similar language in recent days. Do you see that from where you are as a threat to our well-being in the immediate future?
Well, certainly, Peter, what NATO says is simply that no one knows what's in Vladimir Putin's mind, and so they have to be ready for everything. And this is what NATO was created to do, to alert every defense that it has possible among its 30 allies, just in case. And I think that they've been very reluctant to make predictions about what Vladimir Putin will do. What they say is they have to be ready for everything he can do. And now, of course, we've seen what he can do on the ground in Ukraine.
Vladimir, what's your take on what's going on inside Vladimir Putin's head at this point in time? It's still the guessing game that we've been involved in for days now.
What we know now, it's things which were unimaginable for us, like two weeks ago or 1 week ago, becoming reality on a very fast speed. So I would not surprise if Russia will go on for a nuclear option, especially as Europe saying the shutdown of SWIFT or taking out Russian banks of SWIFT is a nuclear option in terms of sanctions. So Russia just sending a friendly reminder to Europe and to the whole world that Russia has a nuclear option as well. So I would not be surprised.
To what extent, Vladimir, do you think that the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, is now acutely isolated and has a growing sense of his own isolation?
He seems to be quite isolated in the recent TV appearances, but the question is his informational isolation, how much information from outside world he is getting through this inner circle. So, but once again, I have an impression that it's all-out war from the Russian side against the West, against the NATO, against the United States and the European Union. And the escalation is very fast, and the Russian side was always very, very precise in this kind of response tit for that. Like if the Western imposed the sanctions on Russia answering with the same kind of sanctions towards the West. So the stakes are very high right now. And once again, SWIFT as a nuclear options provoked this kind of response from the Russian side, in my opinion.
OK, let's have a close listen to what exactly the Russian leader Vladimir Putin had to say, what we've been talking about here. And then we'll go back to Teri in Brussels to get a further assessment on where this statement leaves us.
Not only are Western countries taking unfriendly economic steps against our country, I mean the illegal sanctions that everyone knows about very well, but the top officials of leading NATO countries are also making aggressive statements about our country. Therefore, I order the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff to put the deterrent forces of the Russian military to a special mode of combat duty.
It's a very interesting phrase, a special mode of combat duty. Just explain to us a little bit about what Malte has already referred to as the technicalities behind this process, this four-stage process that we have.
I don't think anyone knows exactly what Vladimir Putin means by this because we are in uncharted territory, as you've said. But again, what NATO has to do and what its nuclear-armed allies have to do is be ready for anything. Now, it's quite interesting that at this moment, as we are here on the show, there has not been a special meeting called, as far as I'm told, and I have checked with my sources, to discuss specifically this nuclear talk from the Kremlin. But at the same time, everything is always on high alert at NATO, certainly in recent weeks and days. And so they have this nuclear planning group that is always kept abreast of all of the threats throughout the world and looks at what NATO would do as a nuclear-armed alliance with this as its, last stop option for defending the alliance, and everyone inside NATO knows what it would do in case of a nuclear attack. Okay, we don't know exactly what that would be.
Okay, let's move away from the nuclear option to more conventional warfare. There is a sense, and I'm getting it from lots of different sources, that Vladimir Putin has perhaps overreached himself in the operations so far, that they're not going as well as he might have expected, and that obviously has a knock-on effect. What are you hearing where you are at NATO headquarters about that?
We have had intel briefings on the side from Western intelligence officials, and the first night was quite dire. In the first 24 hours, we were told that Kiev could fall within a day, that Russia was controlling the airspace, had taken over key airports and airfields. But by the second day, that had completely changed. And the Ukrainians were fighting back better than anyone had expected. And everyone was praising the bravery of the Ukrainian, not just armed forces, but civilians in fighting back. And so everyone thought maybe this won't be so easy. President Putin will not be able to just walk in and take Ukraine. And then you've seen this outflow of further weapons and contributions from allied states to Ukraine, more lethal weapons. Look at this sea change in the German position. That makes a massive difference. Not only will Germany be sending weapons directly, it will allow other countries that are holding German-made weapons to also ship them to Ukraine. And this is something that Germany had been holding up. So this crisis in Ukraine has really shifted the minds of any reluctant allies to help Ukraine. Okay. Again, there will be no Western boots on the ground, but everything they can do to help Ukraine fight for itself, they're doing.
Vladimir?
At the same time, there's no signs of Russia backtracking on these offensive measures and on the ground in the Ukraine, so we don't know how the Russians will react. It's true that this offensive is not that quick and it's not as successful as probably Russian Ministry of Defense or Russian Army and General Staff was planning, but at the same time, there's no signs of Russia going back or stopping these forces. So the offensive on the ground is continuing. There's more Russian troops entering the Ukraine, as far as I see from the Russian sources, and there's no signs of any ceasefire as far as we know. Okay, let's hear what Malte has to say. Is Vladimir Putin making headway in the way he would hope or not?
It very much depends on where. Now, it's the first banking day in Moscow and Russia today. Because I think many Russians start right now to feel that their country is at war. If they watch the state television and hear the state news and so on, they were just, not on the same information level as we are in the West. So it very much depends on how the public in Russia will react to, for example, not being able to go to the bank and just take the money out, and to oligarchs who are losing money, and so on and so on. So the reaction of the sanctions that were imposed on Russia is feeling them right now.
Your newspaper today, Malte, had some very interesting lines on this about the credibility of Vladimir Putin in the eyes of ordinary Russians, if you so will. I mean, you carried lines like, "Who believes in Vladimir Putin? Support crumbling," or support crumbling. I think is a devastating line for Vladimir Putin, for the estimation of his credibility.
I can't predict how the public in Russia is reacting to the news of war, that they are really at war. The sons are at war and are dying in Ukraine, which is supposedly a brothers and sisters whom they are fighting too. So I can't predict what is happening. But I would say just to see any kind of diplomacy going to not talking to Vladimir Putin might be a mistake. We still have to find a way, even though we hate him, even though we are disgusted, and even though all these things that I really feel about, you have to deal with him, it might be. Just to wait until he is toppled might prolong this war for weeks and months to come.
And Vladimir, when we talk about these kind of setbacks, there's also been setbacks that Vladimir Putin has had at the Security Council, or the backing from the Chinese that he might have anticipated would be much more positive. He's not getting that either. So that is a diplomatic setback too.
Yes, but if you look back for the 22 years of Vladimir Putin being in power in Russia, his political career began with the war in Chechnya, and it was a very brutal war and very decisive war, and Russian forces are very brutal in suppressing this uprising in Chechnya. Then we had this Aleppo and Syrian operation of the Russian troops, which is quite very brutal as well, or it was very brutal as well. And now we have Russian tanks approaching Kiev in a large numbers. And the Russian Defense Ministry had communicated today, in the morning, to the citizens of Kiev to leave the city, basically, which could be a sign of the Russian big-scale military operation on the city of Kiev. So I would not expect much room to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. I don't see any room for diplomacy left. It's like it's a war.
Teri, how is NATO likely to respond to that kind of talk, that we've now got these large numbers of tanks moving perhaps towards Kiev, and a really serious threat of an aggravation of the tensions and the conflict?
Just to return to the issue of diplomacy, I asked Secretary General Stoltenberg directly, would you still talk to Vladimir Putin after this invasion? And he did not say that he was revoking his invitation to talk to the Russians anytime. I think that they're going to leave open the option, the only reasonable option for ending the conflict, of dialogue. And you'll also note that the European Union, in the sanctions it placed directly on President Putin and on Foreign Minister Lavrov, it did not impose a travel ban on them, because they want them to be able to come and talk. They want people to be able to go and talk to them. Nobody thinks that there's a military solution to this crisis, and that's still the predominant line. But I think you have NATO allies meeting now constantly at 30, all 30 allies around the table, talking about what more they can do to help Ukraine, short, of course, of boots on the ground. But you see more equipment pouring in. You see more aid. You see humanitarian aid. Poland has offered to be a hub for both NATO and the European Union, because you can no longer fly supplies in. So Poland has really stepped up and taken the lead in transporting this equipment, these additional supplies of all kinds, across the border, because that's the only way people see able to get supplementary materials to the Ukrainians at this point.
Okay,
but it's very much touch and go.
Yes, and maybe it should be added, and maybe you agree or not, Teri and Vladimir. I think Vladimir Putin is not interested to talk to the EU or to NATO. What counts for him is Joe Biden, the US president. He's looking for a summit that gives the whole world the impression he goes eye and eye and equal to the American president. And so this could be the last thing that could be offered to him, not now, not today, not tomorrow, but maybe in the next 2 weeks or to come.
What role are the Americans playing at this point in time, Teri? It's a little bit unclear to us from the perspective of the European theatre.
I think I personally was watching yesterday after this renewed talk of nuclear options to see if you would see President Biden come out and make it some kind of address, and he didn't. And so I think that back in Washington, they're very much watching every step and trying to calculate where they can best use their weight. I mean, remember this entire campaign, this buildup, the Americans surprised everyone with how transparent they were and with their intelligence, not just to NATO allies in closed session, but openly speaking from the White House podium about what they saw on the ground, what they expected President Putin might do and when. And they got a lot of skepticism about that. In fact, they may not have had the dates exactly right, but what they warned about did come to pass. And when you talk to people at NATO behind the scenes, they are very appreciative. I mean, there was some skepticism about U.S. intelligence and this strategy of sort of telling everything that you know. But in the end, allies have been appreciative that they didn't feel like the Americans were going this alone. And I think that's why you don't see a lot of unilateral American actions right now. But surely the people with all the intelligence on the ground and they're watching this minute by minute, they're making a plan. We just don't know what it is yet.
Interesting. They're making a plan, but we don't know what is left. Let's shift the focus from that. Come back to Germany and talk about remarkable scenes yesterday over the last 24 hours in the German parliament and on the streets of the German capital, Malte.
It was one of the most symbol-laden days I can think about for the last years. I mean, I attended this demonstration between the Brandenburg Gate and the Column of Victory. It was huge. It was more than 100,000 people, and they paraded towards the Soviet Army memorial. Yeah. In the middle, in the heart of Berlin, with a huge complex with 2 tanks that arrived in Berlin on May 8th or May 7th, I don't know. And the huge Red Army soldiers standing above this, waving Ukrainian flags. And this was a sign of symbolism. Then we have the Bundestag session, when 3 things happened that were unthinkable before. I mean, the SWIFT sanctions, the 100 billion euros spending for defense, and promising for spending like more than 2% of the GDP in future for defense. And I forgot that. And the weapon delivery, which was a taboo in German politics for the last centuries. OK, let's just listen to... I mean, the German leader, Olaf Scholz, that we're referring to here, has in some quarters been accused of not appearing to be fully engaged in facing up to the challenge posed by Vladimir Putin. Now, surely, given what Malte has been saying and what we're about to hear, that can no longer quite apply. Let's listen to Olaf Scholz in his own words.
Putin
wants to create a Russian empire. He wants to reconfigure Europe according to his own ideas, and he does not hesitate to use military violence. We see this today in Ukraine. So we must ask ourselves what capabilities Putin's Russia has, and what capabilities do we need to meet this threat today and in the future. We must invest more in the security of our country to defend our freedom and democracy. From now on, year for year, more than 2% of our GDP will be invested in defense.
For most of the post-war period, Germany has essentially been a pacifist country. There's been a very strong streak of pacifism in German politics. That has now apparently all changed virtually overnight.
Yes, and it's done by a coalition of Social Democrats and Green Party, which are one of the most pacifist-oriented parties in Germany. So it might be the end of German pacifism. I'm not quite sure about that, because pacifism means that you are unwilling to fight. Germany doesn't fight. So we are still the spectators and seeing this war and try to influence it with the SWIFT decision and things like that. But would Germans be willing to fight for that? I have many doubts about that.
Teri, Germany and Germans there's been a revolution in how they perceive their own armed forces. This is a very remarkable event. And what does it mean now for Germany and Europe in the Ukraine crisis, in the Ukraine conflict?
Yesterday, when that speech was on, I could do nothing but just sit and listen and wait for the nuggets to drop about how that would affect NATO, Germany and NATO. You know, what you call a pacifist country is often referred to as a free rider here in Brussels at NATO, because Germany, of course, benefits from the security of the alliance, but many people see it as not having contributed everything it could, and that did all change with this speech. I spoke with someone working in the defense establishment in Berlin who said that, you know, up until now, without this procurement decision announced yesterday, we would be able to know that we could buy sort of 1/4 of an airplane. We didn't know if we would get the funding after that to buy the rest of the plane. I mean, these things that don't sound that important, perhaps, to the public ears are really important for German defense. I mean, the spending above 2% of GDP, as NATO has requested of all allies, that's massive. That, of course, has been something Germany was absolutely lambasted for during the Trump administration, but also in softer ways by other administrations. This is truly a sea change in Germany's role in NATO, and I think it's going to be welcomed very much by everyone there at NATO headquarters, including the Germans themselves, who are no longer going to be under the spotlight for financial reasons.
Vladimir Esipov, what do you have to say about this dramatic development that's being called a turning of the tide here in Germany?
Well, the word dialogue was a mantra of German foreign politics for many weeks before the Russian invasion. It was like repeatedly mentioned in the Bundestag session, dialogue, dialogue, dialogue with Russia. And now we see what's happening on the ground. And all these right measures announced yesterday in the German parliament are long-term measures, financing the military spending and delivering weapons to the Ukraine, but we need to look on the ground what's happening right now in Kiev, around the Kiev and in the Ukrainian
So what you're saying is Vladimir Putin is not
terms.
necessarily going to be very impressed by this development at this point in time?
Once again, Russia sees itself since 8 years at war with the West, since 2014, and since the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. The whole rhetoric of the Russian government, the whole rhetoric of the Russian state media was a war rhetoric for 8 years right now. So it's nothing could impress them. And once again, they have very clear military goals on the ground, in Kiev especially. And as far as we see right now, they're going to achieve their goals.
What do you think, Teri? I can see your ambivalence about that statement. Yeah, just fill me in on exactly what you're thinking there.
No, I think it's true. This isn't going to affect anything perhaps so immediately on the ground, although certainly it will be welcome that now Germany will both directly send weapons to help Ukraine and allow other countries to do so. I mean, that can make an immediate difference. It doesn't speak to whether Ukraine has a possibility to actually win this militarily. But, you know, President Putin had quite a bit of success in Germany in dividing public opinion about what the country should do. I mean, let's not even get into Gerhard Schröder's role there. But, you know, there is a division of opinion. But what Olaf Schultz did yesterday was say, as a country, we are devoting ourselves to NATO. We are devoting a lot more money to NATO. By far the largest economy in Europe. If Germany spends 2% of its GDP on defense, on its own military, that is a massive increase in capabilities available to NATO. Once again, it's just another example of how if Putin wanted a weaker NATO, if Putin wanted a NATO that pulled away from his borders, remember that Germany is there leading an enhanced forward presence in Lithuania, he has achieved now, with even more money behind it, a much stronger NATO.
We're running out of time.
Yes,
quick comments from Vladimir and Malte. Yeah.
At the same time, Ukraine is not a member of the NATO, so the putting money to the NATO is not especially saving the Ukraine. So you can pump NATO with the money and with the weapons, but it will not save the Ukraine.
Interesting.
Yes, but the German reaction to this, which was demonstrated yesterday in the Bundestag, I mean, make it almost impossible to spread disunity between the European Union and in between NATO, because Germany was always considered to be a weak link. I mean, Putin has a special link to Germany. He was not educated, but he worked in Dresden as a KGB officer and so on. He speaks German. So he always tried to pull away Germany from the rest of Europe. And it's not just Germany. It's Hungary, for example, as well. Orban was a close, I would say, almost friend of Putin. And he was joining the SWIFT sanction as well.
OK, I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts with me. I hope we've given our viewers plenty of food for thought about the latest developments in the crisis in Ukraine. Thanks very much for joining us. For now, bye-bye and tschüss.